Um, Hello, everybody. Today, GIZ Fabric is hosting two specialists to provide an overview of grievance mechanism options for manufacturers. My name is Stephen Frost. I'm your moderator today, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this technical seminar on behalf of GIZ Fabric. As all of you know, various jurisdictions have either legislated or are in the process of legislating human rights due diligence laws. For example, Germany's new due diligence law will come into effect next year in January. And earlier this month, the EU issued a draft due diligence law bill as well. And other jurisdictions are talking about these sorts of things. As New York has a bill in front of the Senate now, the New York Fashion Act, and so on and so forth. A common component in many of these laws or these bills is the obligation of businesses to exercise due diligence in their supply chain in accordance with human rights requirements as set out under the law. For example, in the German law, one of those obligations is the establishment of a complaints procedure. So as a minimum requirement, suppliers will have to have an effective complaints procedure in place. And so this is a very brief kind of contextual background for this technical session. So at the end of this, you should be able to assess the basic effectiveness of a grievance mechanism system that you might have in place. Our speakers are not to tell you exactly what you should do, but to provide an overview of options so that you can assess your own system's effectiveness. Right. So this is not a session where we're telling you what you must do, providing a range of options and looking at what effectiveness would look like under those options. Both of our speakers today, we're very grateful to have two people with an enormous amount of experience in working with various brands, particularly European brands, on today's topic. They've been conducting research on various approaches and providing guidance on factory level grievance mechanisms. Lieselot Germans is the Grievance Mechanism Coordinator for Fair Wear in the Netherlands, and she's been working on these issues for a number of years. You can see her bio in the invitation, but I think the main takeaway from Lieselot's bio there is that she's been working with a large number of European buyers in the fashion industry, retailers and brands, and working with companies and their suppliers in guiding and implementing grievance mechanisms. Lieselot is joined by Sophia Menfalatte. She's a human rights due diligence implementation coordinator also at Fair Wear, with also a broad range of experience on this topic, with particularly in-country implementation of systems or grievance mechanisms. Look, without any further ado, I'm just going to hand it straight over to Lieselot and Sophia. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. We do have a presentation as well that we made for you today on this, and I think it's being shown on the screen. Let me see. Here we go. I can now see it as well. Yeah, so as Stephen was saying, we've been invited today to talk about access to remedy and grievance mechanisms. And what we're going to do is basically we're going to split it up into two parts, our presentation today. George, if you could go to the next slide. Oh, I don't know if it's me, but right now I just see a black screen.
I also can see it.
See, here we go. Yes, this looks good. So we're going to start with just a very, very brief introduction to access to remedy. Then we're going to look more at internal grievance mechanisms, followed by external grievance mechanisms, and then we'll have a Q&A and discussion for you afterwards. So with internal and external grievance mechanisms, we split it up like that because there's a real difference about who's involved and what you can do with those things there. But if we can go to the next slide to just quickly introduce access to remedy more as a concept. And the next slide again. So what is access to remedy? So this is a definition that we've pulled actually from the OECD. And it says that for companies, access to remedy is actually a part of the due diligence process. As Stephen was already saying, a backdrop for today's meeting is some of the HRDD legislation that is coming out in Europe, both the one that's already been implemented in Germany, but also the draft that's been released on an EU level. And businesses, companies are going to really have to do a lot more in terms of human rights due diligence and providing access to remedy for victims of abuse, as it's mentioned here, or those that have had their human and labor rights violated, and how these companies have caused or contributed to that, and that they need to take responsibility for that and work towards remediating those issues. And if we can go to the next slide. So as we see, there is also, although we've split it up basically into two today, internal and external mechanisms, what we really see is that there are three different types of access to remedy. First, there's on the internal side, there's factory level grievance mechanisms. Then we also have state-based and judicial systems. And then we have external, or what's also sometimes called backup mechanisms. So factory level grievance mechanisms are when they are worker-led, they really offer an effective and the most sustainable form of redress to grievances. It's close to the source, it's happening in the place where the issue occurred, it's solved quickly and in a way that actually creates more trust between factory management in this case and the workers, and really solves issues where it is. But we see in practice that these factory level grievance mechanisms are often really underdeveloped. They're often also not trusted by the different stakeholders involved. Also, it happens that they're not independent, as in that they're not worker led. So we see that there are problems with these in the industry. Then when we look at national, state-based or judicial systems, that's where we think of things like the national legal system, so courts, arbitration, labor inspectorate, those kind of things constitute the state-based system, where people who've had their rights, or rather the laws, were not adhered to, that they can access this method of remedy, go to the courts, get a binding finding, and have their rights reinstated. On the flip side, this can be costly, it can be time intensive, and it can also be seen as unfair or biased by certain affected groups. And also sometimes it's really not very easily available, again, depending on the country specific context. Then when we look at external or backup mechanisms, that they are in place for when these other two types of access to remedy, when they fail. So the idea is that they are a backup, for when other things are not available. And these ensure that businesses fulfill their obligations to provide access to remedy in supply chains. Thank you. And then next slide. And I think Sophia will take us through the central pillars from the UN Guiding Principles on access to remedy.
Yeah, thank you. So according to the UN Guiding Principles from 2011, an effective and functional grievance mechanism should be legitimate, accessible, predictable, equitable, transparent, REST compatible, a source of continuous learning, and based on engagement and dialogue. If a mechanism can fill all these 8 criteria, then it can be considered functional. But of course, we know that in reality, it is much more complex than that to assess whether a mechanism can fill in all these 8 criteria. And so on the right, you can see some guiding questions that you can ask yourself or that your client may ask about a mechanism that is present in your supplier. And for example, if you want to assess whether a mechanism is legitimate, you can ask whether there is a defined, formalized process to address grievances. What are the steps that lead to the resolution? Is there a time frame? If you want to know whether a mechanism is accessible, you should ask whether, for example, all workers can have equal access to it if the mechanism is advertised in the languages spoken by the users, and so on. For example, another important one is that the mechanism has to be based on engagement and dialogue. And for example, you may ask if a system for feedback collection from the users is established. And that is very important because when you receive feedback from the users, you're also able to integrate the learnings that come from that feedback and to evaluate the performance of the mechanism, and then you can improve that. And if we can go to the next slide, Liselott can continue to get through the presentation.
Yeah, so this slide I'm actually not going to spend too much time on, also because of the really great introduction that Stephen gave earlier. But that in these human rights due diligence legislation, companies are required to ensure that there is some kind of operational grievance mechanism available for workers and stakeholders in their supply chain. But one of the risks that we see when we see this is that every brand, every company could set up kind of their own system with their own email address, maybe their own phone number, which will lead to, which could have the risk of leading to many different parallel systems popping up, which could lead to kind of a wall of posters on the factory floor with all these different types of systems. And that's difficult for the workers to navigate, like what system is best for what kind of issue, how do each of the systems work, what kind of process is involved, will I speak to an actual person, will I only have an interactive or a technological solution. It makes it very difficult for workers to navigate through, but it's also really difficult for suppliers to know when what to expect when an issue is raised through one mechanism versus another. So that's something that we see as Fairware as a potential risk from this, while we really, of course, support and are in favor of good human rights due diligence, and that it's extremely important for brands to carry this out. But we do see there are risks attached to a lot of different parallel grievance mechanisms popping up. So we are looking at, from our perspective, how we can have more of a network-based approach to grievance mechanisms, potentially with other MSIs, and looking at options and ways to make this easier for both workers and suppliers. But this is something that we've noticed. So yes, could we go to the next slide, please? And before we go into really diving into the internal and external mechanisms, what we do want to say is, and want to really underline, is that access to remedy and grievances should be seen as a good thing. Yeah, we definitely don't want them to be seen as a negative thing, but rather to frame it in more of a positive light. Issues are being brought to light within your factory, and when issues are known, they can be solved. It's a chance for remediation, a chance for improving working conditions in a really very direct way. And studies have shown that improved working conditions lead to improved worker satisfaction, which in turn leads to improved productivity. So it's really in everyone's best interest to have this kind of remediation and improving the situation. It's a channel for workers' voices to be heard directly, even in cases where they might be scared or nervous about speaking up. It's a really good way to still have their voices and hear them. And it's also a chance for suppliers and companies to strengthen their relationships together, as it's working together on a common cause to solve issues together. Thank you. And the next slide, which is factory level grievance mechanisms. And I will hand over to Sophia again for this.
Yeah, thank you. So as my colleague mentioned before, when we think about grievance mechanisms, usually we think about state-based or judicial mechanisms or non-judicial ones. And when we think about non-judicial ones, usually we distinguish between external mechanisms, which Liselott will talk about later on, and internal mechanisms. Internal mechanisms are also defined as factory-level grievance mechanisms. It means that they are internally managed by the enterprise at the supplier level. It means that the access point to the mechanism is internal to the supplier, and same thing goes for the grievance process that follows the access point. The grievance process can be formal or informal, but is always administered by the supplier, sometimes in collaboration with worker representatives. And when we talk about access points, we mean, for example, meetings with work representatives or supervisors, but we also mean online tools or suggestion boxes. And that is the first access to the mechanism. And then the process is everything that happens after the reception of the complaint. So we can think about the filing of the complaint, the investigation, the follow-ups, the remediation, the evaluation, and finally also the possibility for complainants to appeal to the decision. And let me now give you an example. Let's imagine that in a supplier, there have been several health and safety accidents because, for example, there are not enough protective gloves for the cutting operators in a certain department. Then a worker might raise the issue during a meeting with his supervisor, and he may also provide suggestions. If there is a formalized grievance procedure, then the supervisor, which in this case is the access point to the mechanism, will then raise the complaint to, let's say, the Health and Safety Committee or the Health and Safety Department or the relevant HR staff. And from there, the complaint is then raised to the relevant management that can then take a decision and purchase more protective gloves for the cutting operators that are at the supplier. This means that the procedure is standardized and that every complaint is then filed and it will lead to a resolution. If we follow the standards that the UN Guiding Principle provides us, what we want to ensure is also that the complainant is then aware of what the resolution has been, and not only the complainant, but also all workers. So all workers should be then informed about the purchasing of the gloves. And this ensures that as many workers as possible know about the resolution of complaints and can then trust the mechanism more and more. If we can then go to the next slide. So what I just talked about now can be seen as an ideal scenario, but then we know that in reality, situations can be much more complex than that. So let's imagine that the supervisor was overworked and that he did not raise the complaint to the relevant HR or health and safety department. If there is no formalized procedure, this means that the complaint is lost completely. Or let's say that the worker is a female and for whatever reason, she doesn't feel comfortable with raising this issue or another issue to her supervisor because the supervisor is a male, and that is the case in several countries. So this means that the mechanism is not accessible to all categories of workers. And so there are certain groups that will be left out from the mechanism. In this case, then, how can we improve the mechanism? How can we improve its accessibility? For example, we can think about providing more than one access point. So the worker, the female worker, for example, will not just be able to go to her supervisor, but she would also be able to file a complaint through an online tool or a suggestion box that can ensure her anonymity. And this is one of the many ways to improve factory level grievance mechanisms. So it's important when we want to provide access points to consult workers on what is the access point that they would use the most, what is more convenient for them, and this will ensure that then the mechanism is actually used. Another way to improve a mechanism is to make sure that there is a formalized, clear process for the grievance resolution, that this process is really communicated to the workers, and that there is a reporting to the workers about the performance of the mechanism itself. We want to make sure that the mechanism is advertised through notice boards or during meetings, during trainings, on wage slips. And the mechanism should be described in its process, the benefits should be highlighted, and also we should make sure that workers know what are the available access points. Another thing to really keep in mind is that smaller issues are always more important than we think, and it's important to never overlook them because many times if smaller issues are not addressed, they might lead to an escalation of complaints, which might lead to higher costs and higher resources needed to resolve the complaint. If we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, then why are factory level grievance mechanisms good for you? They are a benefit for supplier because if workers know the process, if they were consulted on the most convenient access points, they will use the mechanism. And once they use the mechanism, you will know directly from the source what are the issues present at your supplier. You will not get the information through audits or through your clients or through an external mechanism, but it will come directly from the source. And this will ensure that you will be aware of what are potential future issues that might come up, and you will be able and have the control to make the changes and improve the situation in a cheaper, faster, and more efficient way. And definitely cheaper than if the complaint was escalated to the judicial level or into a judicial mechanism. We can go to the next slide. So if you and your supplier have a functional factory level grievance mechanism, this can really be a great added value. Why would they be important or good for your clients? Because your client will want to comply with international but also national standards and legislations, which prescribe the existence of an internal and an external grievance mechanism. Because the presence of such a mechanism will lower the risk of labor rights violations, lower the escalation of grievances, which in turn will lead to lower costs for you and for your client. And because your client will want to have more sustainable supply chains and minimize delivery interruptions. And both these things are possible with a functional mechanism. And so what can you show to your clients as an evidence on the functionality of an internal mechanism? You could show your internal policy on the formalized grievance resolution procedure. You could show complaints data if you have a data management system internal to the supplier. So you could show the frequency of complaints, the resolutions. You could show meeting minutes or meeting agendas if you have complaints committee or a workers committee as one of the access points to the mechanism, or you can show proof of democratic election of worker representatives as well. Next slide, please. Next one. Okay, yeah, here we go. Then I just want to mention technological solutions, because in the last years we have seen an upward trend in the use of online tools, especially in countries with increasing smartphone coverage, and that is the case of Vietnam, for example. Because online tools, so online softwares, online apps, can really be cost and time effective and easy to use if workers have access to a smartphone, and they can ensure anonymity. Some examples are web platform, Zalo, Facebook Messenger, and internal company softwares. Through these online tools, suppliers can receive information from their employees, notify them with information without the use of flyers or audio communications, but in a more direct way through text. Suppliers can also collect questions and complaints and measure the frequency of certain questions. And once you know the frequency of grievances, you can also find then more effective ways to solve them or to communicate to your workers and to address questions that are raised the most. Thank you. Now Liselott will guide you through, yes, the next slides.
Thanks, Sophia. So then moving on from the internal grievance mechanisms, we're looking at external grievance mechanisms. So I would classify external grievance channels into three main different ones. There's state-based systems. So as I mentioned earlier, things like the labor inspectorate, courts and arbitration. There are trade unions, which can both be factory specific or more on a national level. There are even international trade unions as well. And then there are these backup systems, which can be led by MSIs, NGOs, can also have some brand grievance mechanisms in there. Another example is the OECD national contact points as a backup mechanism. I'll very briefly touch upon the first two and go into more detail about the backup mechanisms, because that is really where my expertise lies as well. If we could go to the next slide, please. So what state-based systems are available really differ per country. Questions like what is actually available, what they are based on the national law. As I said as well, they can be really time and resource intensive, and they can be sometimes seen as unfair or biased by stakeholders. For example, in some countries, there could be a fear of corruption on this kind of level. When they are functioning well, they are extremely effective, and they also create a binding avenue for redress. Once issues are being raised through state-based systems, a court decides on what needs to happen, on what is the resolution for a case. That is binding and needs to be carried out both by the complainant, but also, or the plaintiff, and by the company that it is against. What's important for you as a supplier is that you're a member of staff. I'm saying here HR manager, but it's not necessary that that person needs to be it, but just somebody within your staff should have knowledge about what state-based systems are available and be able to advise workers about this when this might be a good avenue for them. So this is state-based systems, and again, what is available really depends on which country you're in, and how effective it is as well depends on the national context. Next slide, please. Then when we look at trade unions, we know trade unions are an ideal channel for workers or for grievance redress. But again, depending on your country, there can be a lack of availability of trade unions or a lack of functionality and how they function, how they work. For example, if we look at just not talking about the functionality here, but looking at some of the country differences. If we look at Vietnam, we have a really strong trade union related to the national party, to the government. Whereas in some other countries, there's very little trade union activity at all. So what's possible there is dependent on that as well. If there are trade union representatives at the factory or in the supplier, they are really well placed to assist workers in resolving their grievances. a way to establish more trust between the supplier and the trade union is to establish a collective bargaining agreement, to have that in place. It really builds trust and communication between factory management and trade unions, and by building this trust can also lead to a more effective grievance redress when issues are raised to the trade union about issues within the supplier. Thank you. Next slide, please. But as I said, I'm going to be focusing more on these backup mechanisms in my section. And these are kind of what is there, what fills the gap when other things are not available, when the other systems are not sufficiently functional, when they're not trusted, etc. Now, to be really clear about this, the ultimate goal of any backup mechanism should be to be obsolete. It should be that also through grievances being raised in a backup mechanism, that it's almost like a trigger to look at factory level systems. How can they be improved? How can we do more on that level so that workers are able to go to solve their grievances internally? So really, backup systems should want to not be necessary, to really be a safety net. What we do see in practice, however, is that they are, in certain cases, one of the few ways that workers feel like they're able to reach out and to gain redress to their issues. Another characteristic of these backup mechanisms is that there's often involvement of the brands, of the buyers, as these business partners to solve grievances. So they will usually be more involved in solving issues than, for example, with factory level systems or even state-based systems. There's also the potential, I mean, when we're talking about this, we're quite often talking about workers versus factory management, things like that. But with these backup mechanisms, there really is also the potential for suppliers, for factory management to use it themselves when brands, when their clients are using bad purchasing practices. For example, what we saw at Fairware was during when COVID-19 first arrived on the scene, and there was a really stressful time that some buyers were not paying the invoices. And we received a number of complaints from factory management stating that one of their clients had not paid invoices, and those clients happened to be then members of ours, and we were able to pick that up as a grievance, with the complainant being the supplier party and the accused party being the brand. And in that way, we were able to quite quickly resolve, or to help resolve, the issue and create a payment plan so that the invoices were paid in full. Another example of a good reason for a supplier to use such a mechanism against a client is if they cancel orders last minute, etc. So as I said, MSIs are one of the main suppliers of these backup mechanisms, but there are also NGOs who have these OECD national contact points. There are a number of different ways. And if we go to the next slide, we can see some more examples. And these are examples that you might have come across in your day-to-day work as well as garment factories. So we have an example is, for example, the Bangladesh Accord. We have our system from the Fairware Foundation. There's also the system from the Fair Labor Association. There's a pilot program from Amfori BSCI in Vietnam happening at the moment. As mentioned earlier, there's the OECD national contact points, and there's brands' own operational systems. But all of these systems, they really differ in terms of mandate. So what can be a complaint within this system? For example, for us, we're really focused on social rights and social audits rather than environmental issues. So if there's an environmental issue, if it relates to health and safety of workers or of the of workers, then we're able to accept it as a complaint. But if it doesn't, then we're not able to accept environmental issues. Whereas if we look at Bangladesh Accord, that's really focused much more on health and safety issues. And if things fall outside of their mandate, they actually send it to more of the brands to pick up separately. They also differ all in terms of process. For example, the Fair Labor Association is really like the final point of escalation. So if a grievance has tried to be resolved in different ways already and it just doesn't work, then eventually the Fair Labor Association can pick it up as their third-party grievance mechanism to decide what should be done there. They will do a thorough investigation and decide on that. It's also different in terms of who their target users are. As I said just now, the Fair Labor Association is the FLA system is really a final point of escalation, and it's not really catered towards workers being able to access it directly, but more towards their representatives. If we look at our system, the Fairware Foundation system, we see that 90% of our complaints come directly from workers or former workers, and the other 10% are quite equally distributed between factory management, trade unions, NGOs, things like that. Similarly, the OECD national contact points, they're a little bit harder to find for workers themselves. So each of these systems are different in their application, which can make it a bit confusing as well. If we could go to the next slide. What I wanted to do here, but I'll keep this quite brief because I'm looking at the time and I want to leave enough time for discussion, is that I wanted to run through what our system looks like as an example of a backup mechanism. So we have awareness raising activities in all of our on all of our member suppliers about the grievance mechanism, and that is at a minimum what we call the worker information sheet, which is one of those posters which includes our labor standards and information about the grievance mechanism. Other things are trainings being held at factory level to inform workers about the grievance mechanism and their rights. And a final one that we're currently developing is videos that can be shown to workers. In our system, any stakeholder can file a grievance within the supply chain, as I've talked about a little bit earlier. One thing that we find very important in our system is this concept of accessibility. So in all the countries that we're active, we have local complaints handlers who pick up the phone and are able to speak to the complainants in their own language. So if we look at India, for example, we have 6 different complaints handlers who speak the 6 main different languages, so that workers are able to really communicate within their mother tongue or within a language that they're very comfortable in. Another example of that is we're also active in Turkey. And when there were many Syrian refugees there, we made sure we also provided the helpline in Arabic because there was refugees working within the garment sector. And our local complaints handlers, they also have a lot of knowledge about local and international legislation so that they're able to advise the workers, the complainants, but also know what next steps need to be taken. Another important point is that usually we see that grievance mechanisms work best when they're part of a bigger monitoring system, monitoring evaluation system, when there's good relationships between the client and the supplier, and when there's a lot of knowledge about what's happening in the supply chain. I will briefly talk you through the process that a complaint goes through in our system. We usually receive a call, but it can also be a message, an email, different methods that complainants can reach out to us. Then our complaints handler will check the admissibility of a complaint. The admissibility here basically means that it is happened in one of our member suppliers and that it's related to one of the 8 labor standards. And when that's the case, we say that the complaint is admissible. We then inform our member brand about the complaint because they are the one to have the conversation with the supplier about the complaint that was received. So the member brand informs the supplier and asks for a response. That is the next step. What's good to note here is that when we say a complaint is admissible, that doesn't mean we're saying it is true. We're not saying that it is grounded or there's evidence for it, but we're saying we can take this complaint on through our process. And also that's why we ask the member to ask for the supplier's response at this point, because it is one side of the story that we've received here. So we give the supplier a chance to tell their side of the story. And what we usually see here is that one of two things. If the accused party agrees, so it does happen that if we say, hey, or if the member says, hey, we received this complaint, it was, for example, this worker did not receive the correct final settlement when they were dismissed from the job, when they were fired, they actually have a right to such and such, is what they've been saying. It does happen regularly that the factory says, okay, all right, we agree, it should have been that. And then the complainant is paid the correct amount and it's very quickly solved. Most of the time, though, the accused party, the supplier, does not agree and we start an investigation. And the investigation, that's when we really look for evidence to either support or disprove the complaint. So that's where we look for the facts and look for what's true and what's not. Then we call a complaint grounded if we find evidence to support the claim of the complainant, and then we move into a remediation plan. When a remediation plan can consist of a number of different things, it can be a compensation payment if that's relevant, it can be trainings. There are a lot of different steps that can be taken, and it's really dependent on the case. Once the remediation plan has been carried out, usually by the supplier in combination with the client, with the buyer, with our member, we verify the situation and evaluate the complaint as well. And with verify, we mean we ask for evidence that the remediation plan has been carried out they said it would. And we usually check in with the complainant as well to make sure that the activities were carried out and that they actually solved the issue. So this is, in a nutshell, an example of what a backup mechanism can look like, but each backup mechanism will have a slightly different process that it follows. Can we go to the next slide, please? So there is a lot going on there. As I mentioned, there was this whole list of different backup mechanisms, and each have their own mandate, their own process, their own stakeholders, or their own target audience. So I tried to put up a little bit of a do's and don'ts list for a supplier. How can you function within these different systems? So one of the do's is to display posters that workers are able to see them easily, and to engage in the awareness raising activities. To have a staff member who's responsible for following up on grievances. From practice, we see that's often either the HR manager or the CSR manager. Those are really well placed to follow these up. And to see these grievances as an opportunity to improve working conditions, which again leads to increased worker satisfaction, leading to more productivity, and to commit to remediating the issues that arise. It's almost kind of like committing to following up on corrective action plans following an audit. Some things not to do within this context is to retaliate against or threaten workers who file grievances, and see grievance mechanisms as your clients not trusting you. As we've said multiple times today, there's legislation coming out everywhere that requires these things. So that's absolutely not the case. And to see these backup mechanisms as a reason to not strengthen internal systems. The stronger the internal or the factory level grievance mechanisms are, the less likely that these backup systems will need to be used. And the better it is the easier, more cost effective, everything that Sophia talked about to solve grievances. Thank you. And then the next slide. So what to discuss with your clients about grievance mechanisms. So do ask questions about the grievance mechanisms that they are part of, and understand how they work and how different systems fit together. I also know it does ask quite a lot of you as suppliers if there are multiple grievance mechanisms that your clients are a member of, because they're different, they're members of different MSIs or different groups. They have different requirements themselves. So talk with them and understand how you can function within this. What you can also do is tell your new clients about the mechanisms which are already present in your factory because of these different members or these different clients' memberships. Maybe you're an accord, you've signed the accord, those things like that. Another one is to have somebody within your organization who has knowledge and expertise regarding both the state-based systems, but also who knows these different systems and how they work together. And as well, having these trade union representatives can be a really good way to help solve grievances and know how they can support that and how you can interact with them about that. And being able to discuss this with your clients, to tell your clients you have these things in place, makes them able to kind of tick that off the list. Another thing to discuss with your clients is to review their purchasing practices if grievances arise that are related to purchasing practices. An example of that is excessive overtime. So for example, if there's a grievance related to excessive overtime, and this excessive overtime has come around because there's a lot of production pressure from the way that production planning has been created, a way to discuss that then with your clients is to say, well, this is indeed a case that happened, but this is our situation. This is why it came about. How can we work together with you and maybe other clients to relieve some of that pressure? Yeah, that's a way of going about that there as well. Clients will also ask or could ask for evidence about these things, so it's good to think about how you can show this already beforehand. Okay, so this was quite a lot of information, and I can imagine that there's a lot of questions, a lot of points for discussion, both related to what I've said and related to what Sophia said, also ideas, etc. So we would like to open the floor up for that.
Thank you, Lisa. I need to start with a small apology. I forgot to say something during my intro, which was that we will have plenty of time for questions. And if you do have questions, please type them into the chat box. You can see the chat box on your screen. We won't have an open mic because there's quite a lot of people on the call. So if you do have a question, just type the question into the chat box, and I'll integrate it into our Q&A session. So while if you do have a question, start typing, and while you're typing and while you're thinking about questions, there was a lot of information here. Thank you very much. It was a great presentation, a huge amount of information. I wonder if we could go back to just some of it and expand on some of the things that you've talked about. I know you did answer this a little bit towards the end. You did get back into this, but earlier in the talk, you did mention this problem of multiple parallel systems. You know, you've got multiple posters on the wall, you've got multiple brands or retailers. This is our system. If you've got a complaint, use this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What would your recommendation be to a factory owner a manufacturer that is getting multiple system requests? You know, what does the conversation look like from a single manufacturer with multiple clients requiring multiple systems, and it all starts to seem overwhelming? What does that conversation look like?
A very good question, and I'm not sure I can answer that exactly because it will depend on the situation of that specific supplier, what kind of systems the clients are requesting. And I think there it's really important for the supplier to have a good idea of what each grievance mechanism is asking of them, but also that they are able to say, we're already part of this grievance mechanism due to maybe membership to such and such an MSI or through such and such a way, and this is what that looks like, so that the client also has a better idea of what is already present within the supplier, and what is being offered to workers there. That being said, it is something that I recognize as a problem, because it does require quite a lot of suppliers to be able to know how different systems function and to then be able to tell that to different clients, to give that information. So that's really a burden that is currently on the suppliers to be able to figure out a way through that. And that's something, again, that we've seen as a risk from every the requirement for every company to set up their own system. What we are looking at within Fairware is how we can collaborate more with different MSIs, with different groups, so that this pressure is relieved slightly. We're not fully there yet to be able to say this is how it is or this is how we're going to be doing it. But there is a movement within the industry, within the different MSIs, different responsible business conduct platforms that are offering grievance mechanisms or that require grievance mechanisms, to look more at how can we pool resources, collaborate together, and relieve some of that burden there. Another thing that I would like to stress there again as well, to link it back to some of the things that Sophia was saying, by having really strong internal systems, factory level systems, some of this need to be able to navigate these different systems is also relieved when you know that workers are able to reach out to you and to solve grievances internally. There's much less of a need for these backup mechanisms, even when the companies, the brands, do require by legislation or through membership of MSIs to provide these. There will be less need for them to be used.
Mr. Khan, Mr. Khan in the Q&A box has a question. When there are multiple brands that are sourcing from a certain factory and there is a grievance raised from that factory by a worker to Fairware, then how do they communicate with the brands? Which brand takes responsibility in the case? You understand the question, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here there's, of course, if it's multiple Fairware member brands, then the way we communicate with our brands about grievances is we have a system, an information management system. The complaints handler puts the information about the complaint in that, which sends a notification to our brand, our member brand, saying there's been a new complaint, and that they can look into it. They will be asked to discuss that with the supplier. If there are multiple Fairware member brands, at this point they will all receive a notification saying that there's been a new complaint within this certain supplier. But then what we do usually encourage them to do is to decide among themselves who should take the lead in to be the lead brand in resolving this complaint. Some of the things we encourage them to look at is maybe the length of the relationship with the supplier, maybe also leverage, so that it's just and instead of one supplier having to talk to multiple different brands about the same complaint, it's one brand talking to the factory while there's a kind of like, while the others are still involved and know what's going on, but that there's one main contact point, both to make it easier for both the brands and the supplier. What can also happen is that if it's a grievance, and we know of or the brand knows of certain other brands or companies sourcing at that same supplier, what can happen then as well is that they reach out to them to say there's been an issue. And we encourage that, again, in situations where it's really beneficial to have multiple brands looking at their own practices as well. So if we're looking at a case of excessive overtime, we can encourage brands to look at who else is sourcing from that factory, and if they know that, to kind of join forces in looking at what are really the root causes of the issue and how can their purchasing practices, their behavior change that. So there are a few different circumstances. So then it's, again, we do try and say it's best to have one contact point for the supplier, but sometimes it's helpful to have multiple brands be involved in that.
Yeah, thanks. Great answer. Andy Yu in the chat box also has a question around Fairware own practices. He says, Fairware has been doing this for years. Have you ever studied the correlation between the grievances received and the risks, in brackets, from a German company supply chain due diligence perspective?
Good question. So we do
Yes.
look at our data, and we do. I think what we're generally doing it is almost the other way around, though, at the moment. So that we say that if we receive certain complaints within a certain region or a country, X amount of certain complaints can actually mean that we see it as the potential of such a risk rising in that area more generally is also increased. So we've generally looked at it more from that side. What can the data that we receive through complaints tell us about risks in an area or in a country? So I suppose the other way around, we can also look at that and see. Yeah, for example, we do know, because we're also active in Eastern Europe, and we do know the kind of complaints that we receive there are very different than, say, the type of complaints we receive in Southeast Asia or in Bangladesh. So we do see a correlation between the type of risks that are generally present in an area and the type of complaints we receive there. Yeah, we do see that. Yeah, in our data.
Just to add here, I think that's something we're going to do more and more, to study the correlation between the risks and the grievances raised, because now we are adopting a new HRDD policy that will be the framework for all our new future directions. And this means that we're going to adopt an approach that is risk-based. So the risk, as is not mentioned at the country level, will really be defining to understand what are the next steps that could be taken after the grievance, what can be improvement programs that suppliers could put in place.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting question. Yeah, that's interesting. Soxina also in the chat box asks, based on your own experience, your own studies, your research, what are the main causes of grievances? Now, that's a very, that's a very broad question, but I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the main things that we receive grievances on within the Fairware system is actually workers who have been dismissed, who've had their contracts terminated, and that they haven't received the correct final settlements. That's a really common grievance that we receive, and it's also one that's quite quick and easy to solve, both from a brand perspective, but also from a supplier perspective. So that is definitely one that we see a lot of. And then other than that, it does depend a little bit on the country as well, what we see. An example is as well, we do receive some complaints about gender-based violence. They are more difficult to solve. They're also not really the main type, because that's really more related to wages, but we do receive them as well. But yeah, generally saying, we can see that when workers don't receive their wages or not the correct final settlements, that is a really big reason for them to reach out to an external party to try and help solve their issues. In COVID times, we did see it as well when there was delayed payments that we received grievances about that as well. In Eastern Europe, there was an influx of grievances received about bonuses not being paid. And that's actually a nice example as well of how our system can work. So we received a grievance that Easter bonuses weren't paid when Corona first hit. And what we did then in the investigation is we actually found that the complaint wasn't grounded, because legally bonuses don't have to be paid. As long as legal minimum wage is paid. But what we did see was that there was a lack of communication between factory management and the workers, that the workers didn't understand why they weren't receiving this. So while it wasn't while we call it a not grounded complaint, the evidence disproved the complaint. We did still recommend some remediation steps to communicate clearly to workers why this was the case, that they didn't receive the bonuses, and why that wasn't a violation of their rights. So looking at that as well, kind of in this preventative way, how can you prevent a similar complaint from occurring in the future? But yeah, the main grievances we receive are actually related to wages, and final settlements. We do receive complaints about excessive overtime relatively frequently as well. Yeah, but wages is the main one. I can keep talking about this for a long time, so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and just to add an observation on this, and especially on why grievances are raised often after dismissals and because of lack of payment of the final settlement, that is also because I think it's quite common for workers to raise complaints after they lose their job, also because if they do so while they have their job, there is a strong fear of retaliation from the management side. And so it is quite common to workers to reach out to external mechanisms just as a very last resource. And that can be prevented if measures are in place for which workers can feel comfortable enough with raising issues internally first.
Yeah, that's an important insight. Thanks. Lisa, you mentioned during your answer that some issues are difficult to resolve. What's the process when an issue is difficult to resolve? You know, what are the steps? You know, the grievance is made, and it's maybe it's a GBV issue. It's difficult to resolve. What happens when there is no resolution, or it's very difficult to get a resolution?
Yeah, so usually these cases already start during the investigation, that they're quite difficult, because quite often it's hard to find strong proof to either support or to disprove the complaint. So it's usually a word against word situation in gender-based violence issues. In those cases, what we do at Fairware as well is to do worker interviews, and preferably some off-site worker interviews, to really find out whether such a complaint makes sense within the context of the factory, that it isn't a case of an intercollegial dispute that someone is trying to take revenge or something, but that is something that happens within the culture of the supplier. And then for gender-based violence issues, what we often see, because it is a word against word situation, the things that can be addressed are more to do with the culture around it. So that would be including trainings on gender issues. So both for the management and the workers to try and understand what's going on, and to make them to improve the situation. Another type of remediation that we've seen there is in such situations is actually, even though it might sound strange, is putting up CCTV cameras in certain areas in the factory, so that there is more surveillance, and create a safer space through that. Also to look at what are the times of shift times. Do shift times correlate a feeling of a lack of safety when it's perhaps later? So it's really looking at what are different ways that we can address such things. Yeah, and to address them in such a way. So it is, we become more and more creative in looking at what can be done to help create a safer situation.
Yeah, through detective work. I'll just jump to another question from Andy. What's the difference between the factory level grievance mechanism hotline and a consumer service hotline? I think what he's getting at is there are hotlines and there are hotlines. What is it about a grievance mechanism hotline that is it unique, or what does make it unique?
Yeah, Sophia, do you want to go for that with the factory level grievance mechanism connection?
I think I would like to understand more what you mean with consumer service hotline. Are we talking about customers asking for or like raising complaints after?
Yeah, right. Yes. I think that's what Andy means. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I think
yes. He said yes.
Okay, great. I think definitely here the context is very different. The relationships between the two actors are very different. What makes it complex internally in a supplier for a factory level grievance mechanism to function properly are the power dynamics between the stakeholders involved. If we think about a consumer and the person picking up the phone and looking into the complaint, there is not really a relation between them. From the worker's point of view, as we mentioned before, there is a strong fear of retaliation. It is not at all easy to first of all dial the phone number in, whereas for a consumer, it's a whole different approach because it's something that is probably expected from the consumer, that there is a follow-up to their request. And then if we really think about characteristics in terms of procedure, then we could say there are definitely similarities in terms of filing the complaint, having a follow-up to the complaint, and then resolving it. But then, of course, the issues that are raised through a factory level grievance mechanisms could also really show risks of labor right violation in the whole supplier. So they can also pinpoint to possible risks for other categories of workers. And these I would say are the main ways to maybe compare them.
Thank you. We've got a question also from Nkaka Datan, and I kind of integrated the second part of Nkaka Datan's question into a previous one, but the first part of that question is about trust between employers and employees. The trust between employers and employees is still an issue. How can you improve that? There are 4 points to this question.
I can't hear you anymore. I'm not sure if it's just me.
Sorry. Yeah, so can you hear me now?
Yeah, now yes.
Yes, I had a phone call. I think that cut me off. The trust between employers and employees is still an issue. How do you improve that? How does a factory go about developing that trust that's required for this system to work, to be truly functional?
Yeah, Sophia, do you want to go ahead for that one as well?
Yeah. Definitely the issue of trust is a recurring one. Building trust is a really long-term process. We cannot expect that after a meeting between an employer and his or her employees, we're going to see a change, because usually the issue of trust is really has much deeper root causes, and one of them is definitely the cultural context. There are many countries in which employees are used to really keep quiet, basically, and everything that they might say against their employer, they have a fear that could be used against them. And so I think that is something that cannot really be addressed in an easy way. An example of how to improve trust is to roll out trainings, and that's something that we've been doing at Fairware, and to really focus the training on how can communications between the employers and the employees happen in an easier way, in a way that the employees do not feel the fear of raising up their voice. And of course, there should be an effort coming from the employer's side in this sense. Yes, so trainings can be
Yes.
a way to improve that. Consultation with workers is a way to improve that, improving social dialogue at the supplier level. But then, of course, the employers really need to put some active effort in that direction.
Right. And so following on, continuing with this same question thread here, who are the main actors in the remedy stage, and what challenges do you face in the remedy stage?
Yeah, so usually those involved in remediation or in the main actors in the remedy stage are at least within our system. And maybe Sophia can speak a little bit more about what that would be within factory level grievance mechanisms, but within our the Fairware backup mechanism, remediation is really a collaboration between the our member brand and the supplier. So they really work together to solve the issue. Our local team will usually advise remediation steps. They have a lot of knowledge about the local situation, about legislation, etc. So what is needed there. So they will usually create a plan of some sort, but then it's the supplier together with the brand who will actually implement that plan and make sure that those steps are followed up. Another really important actor still in this remedy stage is, of course, the complainant. And that's something that we then as Fairware make sure we do. We keep in contact with the complainant to check in with them. Have the remediation steps been followed out as was written out in the remediation plan? Have they solved the issue? To have that connection and that looking into that. Sometimes we will even ask other workers in the factory as well if they've seen an improvement in the situation. Sometimes in the remedy stage as well, also in the investigation, but it's useful to look at to discuss with other local stakeholders as well to make sure that it is relevant remedy and that it's being carried out properly. So those are the main actors in the remedy stage for our system.
Yeah, and then if we look at factory level grievance mechanisms, definitely, as Liselott mentioned, the complainant is one of the central actors, and the complainant should be involved throughout the remedy procedure. Then, of course, it depends a lot on the supplier and what the supplier chooses their grievance procedure to look like. And it depends on the access points as well. But usually we could say in broad terms that definitely there should be an actor managing or administering the internal grievance system, and that could be an HR staff member, HR department, depending also on the size of the supplier. Sorry. Then definitely management would be included in the remedy stage to reach a conclusion and a resolution for the grievance. And then if we think about the complainant, we can also think about how we can ensure that the complainant rights and needs are respected and represented. Because of power dynamics that are unequal, it could also be that it's more challenging for the worker to ensure that their needs and rights are respected throughout the whole remedy procedure. And so in that case, the presence of worker representatives or of a factory-based trade union or an external trade union or external organization that could ensure that workers' rights are respected throughout the process, they could also be considered part of the actors involved.
Yeah, thank you. Ekata Dan also has a final question, which we've talked a little bit about already, but maybe you could just reiterate some of the points. So my third question is, what are the steps, what steps are taken if the complaints cannot be solved by Fairware or by some other process?
Yeah. So that depends really on the case and the reasons why the grievance can't be solved or the issue can't be solved. And this does sometimes happen, if the reason the remediation or the grievance can't be solved by us and our members is because the factory management refuses to cooperate on remediation, we do eventually suggest, and that the brand has repeatedly tried to get them to join and to engage in remediation activities, then we will advise the brand to start using a responsible exit strategy and to consider exiting the supplier. Because if for a brand as well, if you're sourcing somewhere where these issues cannot be resolved, you're not able to uphold your human rights due diligence and to uphold your responsibility to to everyone within your supply chain there. So that is something we do recommend in very extreme cases. Sometimes if there are other reasons, another more often occurring reason why we can't resolve a complaint is that the brand has stopped sourcing at the factory, that the business relationship has ended. That sometimes happens. In those cases, we simply close the complaint. We report publicly on complaints, and then we will add some kind of a sentence saying that the brand has left the factory or that the business relationship has ended, and while attempts were made at remediation, unfortunately it was no longer possible to remediate the issue. So that's a reason we sometimes close complaints. Another reason that sometimes it's not possible to solve a complaint is because we lose touch with the complainant, or the complainant no longer picks up the phone, etc. And there, what we look at really is whether this is an individual issue, whether it concerns just that singular complainant, or whether it's a structural issue. If it's a single issue, so really about that one complainant, then and we're no longer able to reach out to them, they've changed their phone number, they don't pick up the phone because the process was taking too long, many reasons for that, we also close the complaint, and we say that no more follow-up was possible. If it's a structural case where we know more workers are affected by the issue, then what we will do is more kind of these offsite worker interviews to check that remediation has happened and that the issue has been solved. So we keep it open, and we do look at it in that way. Yeah, and so really, if it's not possible to further solve the complaints, one of the only things we can do is and really not possible is that, because of the lack of remediation, is for brands to consider starting a responsible exit strategy. Yeah, and if that is the reason why we cannot continue with the complaint, that is something that we do. But we don't take that lightly. We think improving the situation, remediating the issue, trying to prevent it from happening in the future, that really is the way to go.
Yeah. Another question here. I think in one of your slides, you had the do's and don'ts, and I think in the don'ts you had something about retaliation. But a question here from Mag: is there any, what about safeguards to protect complainants from dismissal or retaliation? How do you ensure that doesn't happen?
Yeah, first of all, we don't usually share the identity of the complainant or identifying features with factory management to try and protect the complainant as much as possible. In some cases, going back to that one that I've mentioned multiple times, if it's about dismissal and the correct final settlements, then we do sometimes say it will make it easier. Sorry, there's a bit of background noise on my part. Yeah, then we do sometimes say it's easier for the process if the factory is able to know who you are, to look at the correct documents. So that's something that there we look at. But generally, one of the things that within the remediation we ask, of course, we say in our system, don't retaliate, like we should be protecting workers against this, but this is something we also ask our members to really stress with the suppliers, that this is not an acceptable outcome, and that if workers are dismissed unfairly, that reinstatement is a really important part of the process to reinstate the workers if they have been dismissed. It is a really complicated issue, retaliation and dismissal, but we make sure that, or one of the things we try and make sure is that it's really communicated as a zero tolerance issue. If it becomes clear that workers are being retaliated against, or really efforts are being made to try and find out who the complainant is, that it's very clearly communicated that that is unacceptable.
And for an internal system, a factory would need to have mechanisms in place to sort of replicate that, right?
Yeah, there should be definitely policies in place at the supplier level to ensure that there is no retaliation against all those that decide to raise a complaint.
Right, and workers need to be well aware of that, and that
yes,
goes back to building trust, right? About
exactly.
Yeah. What about if a factory rejects a proposed resolution to a problem? This, I get, sort of gets back to unresolved or maybe unresolvable issues. But if Fairware or some other MSI puts forward a resolution and the factory rejects, what happens there? What's the process?
Yeah, so on our side, if a case that we have as a complaint, if that goes to one of the national institutes through the courts, etc., if that is picked up, then we actually pause our process. We say national judicial systems, there's a process that's going on there, and the outcome is binding. So whatever outcomes comes from that is the one we pick up within our system as well. So that's absolutely a possibility. Sometimes complainants also choose that route while they've already got a complaint going with us, to go down the route of judicial systems. But we never want to undermine or to work alongside or parallel to these national institutions. So if a case goes through the court system, we put everything on pause and wait to see what is the outcome of that system. We can sometimes offer support in getting to court dates, etc., if that's necessary, but we don't continue our process as normal.
Yeah, thanks. We've got about a little over 5 minutes left. If you're an attendee to this webinar, if you look in the chat box, we've put in a little link there for your feedback. You just click on the link there. It's from GIZ Fabric. Before you leave the seminar, please take a minute to give us your feedback, and there's a link there. It takes a minute to do. It really helps us to develop this series. This is only our second series in the technical webinar, technical seminar series. We'll be having these every month now throughout the year. So any feedback that you can give us, please dive in there and just take a minute to click on that. Someone's got a question I've never really thought of about this. Are you using grievance and complaint interchangeably, and that in some languages nuance different implications of those two words? And I'm guessing this is from a Chinese speaker. I was thinking of grievance and complaint in Chinese. It's an interesting linguistic question. But is that something that?
Yeah. No, I agree. It's a really
about?
interesting linguistic question. We actually within Fairware, we use them interchangeably, and that's kind of a historical relic on our side. So we created our complaints mechanism back in the early 2000s, and we called it a complaints mechanism. And that was before there was a lot of things going on in the industry around grievances or in international legislation, international questions related to grievances. So for us, it's kind of we used to call it the grievance or the complaint system. We call it the grievance mechanism now, but we do call it complaints and complainants. So for us, we do use them interchangeably. We also know that even within the industry, some people or some organizations can really see complaints more as this individual issue, whereas grievances more structural issues, etc. But we see that within the industry, within the garment producing industry, in English, the two are being used quite interchangeably, and we like to cast a slightly wider net. But there are definitely nuances, and in some languages, the nuances are much more pronounced. So that's something to take into consideration, especially when translating information into those languages and working with that. So that's something to take into account, but we do use them very much interchangeably.
All right, I've got two more questions. I'll keep the very short one to the last one, but the second last question here is, how are complainants kept up to date on the results or the status of their issue and the remedy and so on and so forth?
Yeah, our complaints handlers are in contact with the complainants throughout the process. So whenever there's a change, or even if there's not an update to give, but a bit of time has passed, maybe 2 weeks, the complaint handler will reach out by phone to the complainant and just give them an update on what's going on. So that's how we as Fairware keep in contact with the complainants. In factory level grievance mechanisms, it's a little bit different. Sophia, do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, sure. Well, in that case, it really depends a lot on the type of access points that every supplier decide to set up in place. Because if the complaint is raised through an online tool, for example, that even if it ensures the anonymity of the complainant, then potentially the outcome of the grievance procedure could be communicated to the complainant through the online tool or the software or the application that is used. If then the complaint is raised within a worker committee or a worker management committee, then there could be other kind of ways in which the result can be communicated, but it can be through going back to the complainant specifically, or through representatives, for example, that then could share the information.
Yeah, thanks. All right, we're almost out of time. Last question is a very simple one. Leonie wants to know if she can get hold of the presentation that you gave. Is that possible? The slides or not?
We can't hear you, Lislot.
Forgot to unmute myself.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's definitely possible. I was wondering, is that easiest for George to send as a PDF to all the participants afterwards?
So if that's a yes, yes. If that's a yes, so Leonie, that's a yes. Fairware will coordinate with the IT people, and then we can send it out to attendees, anyone who was on the call. Thanks very much for that. All right, our 90 minutes is up according to my clock. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much to our two speakers. I think an enormous amount of information there. I can see why Leonie does want the slides. There's some really nice sort of checklist stuff there, particularly around the 8 criteria to be effective, slide on the evidence of functionality, the do's and the don'ts. Yeah, look, there's a whole, there's a number of slides there. I think that would be very, very useful for any manufacturer who's got a grievance mechanism in place, just to go through and think, does my grievance mechanism or does my complaints procedure meet some or all of these criteria, and what holes might I need to fill? Yeah, tremendous amount of information. So thank you very much to both speakers. I really appreciate your time, and everyone could just join with me in a little bit of virtual applause. Just look in the chat box. If you haven't done the little survey there, click on the link. We would really appreciate that to help us do better in future. Otherwise, that's all from me, and thank you very much. Goodbye, and stay safe and healthy. Thank you.